Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Freedom from the Struggle podcast, which is now, of course, become the Deliverance Project podcast. We just wanted to let you know that we're on break in between season 3 and season 4. However, we didn't want to leave you without content. So this week, on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we're going to play 3 previous Patreon episodes that were behind the paywall. We just want to give you a chance to not only hear some more content, but also get a sample of what we do on Patreon. If it's something that you like, you can subscribe on Patreon at patreon.com/The Deliverance Project. We hope to see you for the season premiere on December 4th. May God bless you and bring you peace. Thanks for tuning in. Hello, and thank you for joining us on this bonus episode of the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Corelli. Tonight, we have a case that is very controversial and is one that will make you consider the concepts of deliverance ministry versus medical or psychological conditions. Not only is this case controversial, but it is one that is often mentioned when it comes to people trying to discredit deliverance ministry or to blame deliverance ministers for harming others. Now, by the end of this story, I don't think we're going to have a clear-cut answer. That is not the purpose of me choosing this topic for this bonus episode. The purpose is to make you think. So without further ado, I want to get to the possession of Kennedy Ife. Now, in August of 2016, in northern London, very close to a place called Enfield, and for those of you paranormal enthusiasts, we all know of the ghost of Enfield or the Enfield haunting that was featured in one of the Conjuring movies, as well as is associated to Ed and Lorraine Warren. Now, very close, not right across the street, but in this general area of North London, this case takes place. And a man named Kennedy Ife was a 26-year-old IT professional, but he still lived at home with his family, and this was a family from Nigeria. They were very successful people. They had some money. They lived in a very big home. And Kennedy's father, Kenneth, was actually known to have even associated with the likes of Queen Elizabeth. Now, Kennedy was one of 6 boys. And again, his father's name was Kenneth, and his mother was known as Mother Josephine, but in their church, she was also known as Sister Joe. So a very prominent member of their church. Now, it's important to note that in August of 2016, Kennedy went to a Chinese buffet and had some food. And that will become important not only now, but as the story progresses, because it's part of what the debate or the argument is for this specific case in regards to deliverance ministry. So very shortly after he ate at this buffet, he complained about a pain in his throat. And it was so bad that he actually went to the doctor, but the doctor found nothing substantial and basically sent him home. But it's important to note that he said he felt something crawling around in there. Now, I'm somebody who's had very severe food poisoning before. I won't mention the name of the fast food restaurant that I found this food poisoning, but actually myself and my sister both ate the same thing from the same restaurant and were so sick that we didn't even call each other. It wasn't until later that we both found out that we had the same symptoms. And I can tell you, if you've ever had food poisoning at any severe level, it's a pretty severe experience. I actually wondered if I was going to live or die. The dehydration, just not being able to even move without vomiting and just expelling everything within my body. And you probably would be honest, if you've had food poisoning, the dying wouldn't be the worst thing in that moment. That's how awful the experience is. But I say that to say that I never felt something crawling around inside of me. So that is something that, should catch your attention right off the bat. Well, as he went home, Kennedy's well-being quickly deteriorated. But what's interesting is that Kennedy began to attack his family. So they say that he was acting almost like a toddler. He would lash out, have extreme outbursts, throw his food on the floor, which was very uncharacteristic of a 26-year-old professional. Again, this man works in IT, so he's not somebody who is prone to this type of behavior. So it was considered odd. And that's important because as he began to attack his family physically, his family, his brothers, made a decision that they would subdue him by tying him to the bed with cable ties, or what's known as zip ties, if you know what I'm saying there. They're the type of ties that if you have a bunch of wires, you tie them together by inserting some plastic, one piece of the plastic into the end and zipping it closed. You can even see these larger ones that are used sometimes by law enforcement if they have to subdue several people because they run out of handcuffs. They'll start using cable ties or zip ties. So you can find these big enough that somebody cannot remove them. As his behavior became odd, and he wasn't subdued the entire time. The family stated that they would actually only subdue him for maybe 20 minutes at a time, and then they would let him go as he calmed down. But it's interesting that one day, or and this only happened over a period of a couple of days, his brother found him in the hallway with his hands in his boxers, and he was acting very strange, almost in a trance, and was mumbling. And then all of a sudden, he began to scream and shout about the mark of the beast and the serpent. And he got so worked up that he started to scream that he was going to cut off his own genitals as a way to get rid of the evil that was attached to him. Now, I'm going to kind of paint a picture here because many Monday morning quarterbacks and even law enforcement, as well as the jury, had to consider this because when and by the way, I'm kind of giving you a hint that this man did die. That's why there was a jury involved. But they had to consider that this doesn't appear to be a common case of food poisoning that would cause somebody to lash out violently and threaten to cut off their own genitals as a way to expel the evil. Another time, one of his brothers overheard him and walked into a room in Kennedy's room where he was actually having a conversation with himself in what was described as two different voices. So he was asking questions, answering questions in two different voices. And the family, being very religious, made the assumption that he was probably under the influence of a demon. A, because of what they witnessed, but B, because of the things he was saying. Now, as you're rambling about the mark of the beast and threatening to cut your genitals off, you would see these moments. But for example, at the episode where he threatened to cut off his genitals, he seemed to snap out of what was considered a trance and then just started praying for forgiveness. So as the family is looking at this, according to their story, they're sizing this up, saying these are the two sides of him, and this must be demonic because he's having these evil episodes, and then when he snaps out of it, he's back to being a person of faith. Towards the end, before it got to a place where an exorcism was mandated by the family, we'll say. He said there was a seed growing in him and that it would grow into a large python like snake, which was what he was trying to subdue. So on August 20th at 10:59 p.m., a member of the church, which is their church, and let me talk about that church for a little bit. The name of their church or their denomination was called the Jesus Sanctuary Ministries of London. And it's important to know that this is a non-denominational branch of Christianity, and there's actually only a few churches or branches associated with this particular sect of Christianity. There's one in London. There's actually one in Georgia in the United States. And then the other six churches associated with this sect are all in Nigeria, where the family is from. And so two members or three members of the church were summoned to the house to assess Kennedy's situation. And one of the members is a man named Andrew. Now, I want to not even try to destroy this last name, so we'll just call him Andrew W. because it's a very, very long, hard to pronounce name, at least for me. So Andrew came with a couple of the members of the church as a volunteer to come and assess his situation. Now, this is important to the case as well as to the story because Andrew stated that Kennedy was simply sitting on the couch texting. He said hi, and I'm paraphrasing. You can find the original quotes if you do your own studies. He said hi. Kennedy said hello back. He said that Kennedy looked like he may have a fever and that he just didn't look well. But he was sitting on the couch texting and conversing. But Andrew, at least from what we could tell, did not really assess it as a demonic possession, at least in the moment that he was in charge. Now, it should be known that his father, Kenneth, did show up with a minister from another church. And that minister, that man was accompanied by two other women who were assistants. And due to some discussion, Sister Joe actually insisted that the new minister take over the care of Kennedy and that Andrew and his team would no longer be leading or at least assessing what was going on with Kennedy. Now, I'm going to leave out a lot of details because that's something you can easily view if you decided to research this case by simply looking at court transcripts. For the purpose of time in this episode, it's just assumed that this exorcism, which lasted approximately 3 days from the 19th to the 22nd, late 19, obviously, basically the 20th to the 22nd, was one that was severe because we'll hear about some injuries and some evidence of that in a second. But on August 22nd, in the morning, one of Kennedy's brothers decided to call 999, which is in the United States, we call that 911, but their emergency services are reached by dialing 999. And his brother stated that Kennedy was complaining about his breathing and that he was getting a little cold to the touch. So the paramedics arrived just a little bit after 10 a.m. on August 22nd, and Kennedy was actually pronounced dead at 10:17 a.m. So it's kind of a contradictory statement unless you understand what this was looking like in terms of the paramedics, because although he was feeling cold to the touch, it stated that he had a fever that was approximately 105 degrees. So he was burning up on the inside, but his skin was cold on the outside, probably because he was deceased and that they were simply feeling him that his body was getting cold, even though his fever was very high. Now, Another thing that's important to note is one of the brothers, as well as the family, throughout the different periods of the first responders being on scene, they were known to be saying prayers of resurrection, but one brother was actually praying a very emphatic resurrection prayer, stating to the effect that they're not going to take a corpse out of this house because there's no corpse in here, that he's going to come back to life. Well, of course, he did not. So, shortly after, all seven of the family members, the remaining family members, were charged with three counts: one count of manslaughter, one count of false imprisonment, and one count of causing the death of a vulnerable adult. Now, I said I was going to discuss this, and let's discuss why we can get an assumption of what was happening during the roughly 3 days of exorcism. An autopsy revealed that there were 60 wounds, give or take, on his body. And these were bruises, bruises from the restraints. There was even said to be one bite mark on Kennedy that was possibly self inflicted. But it doesn't appear to be that they know that for sure. It is stated that Kennedy, at one point in time, tried to bite family members. So it's not unfathomable, if the story is true, that he was biting himself and other people. Now, the autopsy actually realized or stated that his official cause of death was cardiac arrest. Now, I'm going to break this down a little bit in terms of a kind of a deliverance versus medical or mental health issue. Now, somebody who's performed deliverance ministry before will know that in most cases, when you're performing deliverance, because many times people are still cognizant of what's going on around them, they haven't succumbed so much to the demonic that they're not themselves anymore. Now, you will see the demon vacillate between taking control and not. But most of the time, you'll pray for somebody, you're asking them how they're feeling, you're asking what's going on, you'll trigger them a little bit, and the demon will come out. But while you are praying deliverance, for the most part, they're coherent of what's going on. So, in many cases, or in I would say most cases, there's not really an overt medical concern. I say that to say, in some cases, because the possession may be so severe or the symptoms may be so severe that it is very vital, and I mean very vital, to have assessed what other possibilities besides somebody being demonized is going on. Now, in this case, I am very aware that they originally or initially went to the doctor, but once the doctor found that nothing was wrong, they seemed to kind of give up on that. But as just I guess, a person or a human being or a family member, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say or what I want to say, but I think I would have probably taken them back to the doctor. I would have taken Kennedy back stating, I know you said that there was nothing going on here, but he just doesn't look right. He doesn't feel right. He looks like he might be sick. Can you check him again? And even if they couldn't quite tell what was causing his symptoms, they still might be able to put him on an IV and get him rehydrated. Because according to Andrew, he appeared to show signs of possible dehydration or illness. Now, with that being said, food poisoning as the cause, because he ate at this Chinese buffet and then shortly after got ill seemed to be what was focused on, and definitely by some of the sources that I listened to, and I'll give them some shout outs here in a minute. But dehydration can cause some of these symptoms in terms of maybe being delirious, definitely maybe being frustrated or angry, food poisoning itself. And, there's many of you that have way more medical training than me. So, there may be some crossover symptoms, but delusions at this level do not appear to be at least directly associated with food poisoning, which may cause you to believe that there was some other underlying mental health issues. And whether or not the family noticed them, it's not often that this is discussed. But as a mental health professional myself, I have more than a handful of times, more than a couple handfuls of times, have treated people who had done the first part of their life fairly normal with minimal symptoms that they didn't consider anything of concern until they had what would be considered a psychotic break. So, age 26 is definitely not too old for somebody to begin manifesting symptoms of a mental health disorder as in terms of it just coming out of nowhere. I don't think we know enough information because the family is very spiritual and very religious, and therefore they probably wouldn't consider a lot of behaviors that could have been warning signs of mental health issues, because their instinct would have been to pray for their family member or family members who maybe were acting a little odd. And so everything would have been attributed to demons. But with that being said, this family was in a situation where they had to restrain their family member for 20-minute intervals because he was attacking them. Now, some people who have commentated on this story have said, well, how much evidence do we have? Because the family is telling the story, not Kennedy himself. However, when you consider that there's two parents and six children, leaving seven remaining people telling the same story and backing each other up, that's pretty hard to do with that number of people. Now, if it was one parent or two parents and one child, they may have gotten together and concocted a story to protect themselves, but it's a lot harder to do because somebody more than likely would have cracked. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. And this gentleman was doing things like attacking his mother to where she had to run and blockade herself in the room. And then his brothers had to subdue him and tie him down. Another brother was punched. They stated that he became menacing, stood up to attack them when they were saying devotionals. That sounds demonic. Now, I wasn't there, you weren't there, so we don't know. And the point of me telling this story is very much to discuss that. Now, before we get to some commentary on my part, I want to let you know, in case you have never heard of this story, that in 2019, this case was tried. Now, that's not very long ago. A lot of the stories we tell about possessions are from many, many decades ago. Some of the big ones, the case of who they call Roland Doe, which wasn't his real name, but that was the actual possession case that became the story of The Exorcist. But instead of a young girl, it was a young boy. That's from decades ago. You're talking about Annalise Michel decades ago, the story that became the exorcism of Emily Rose. These cases are old, But 2019, where these people were tried, wasn't that long ago. And even 2016 is less than a decade ago. So the jury deliberated in these trials for 4 days, but the family was actually found not guilty on all charges. And the court roughly, what's stated that was said is that it was a family issue, that it was a domestic issue, that it wasn't manslaughter. It's important to know, and I think this is a very big key to the or piece of the puzzle that we're speaking about, is one jury member was seen smiling and nodding to the family before the verdict was read, almost as if to say, "You're gonna be all right." Now, those are the details of the case, and I'm gonna say this first before we get to some commentary. I am normally somebody who encourages you to shy away from watching some videos or stories of some of these extreme possession cases. And there's a reason for that. People who are susceptible to demonic oppression, attack, demonic influence, I believe a lot of times if we're watching this type of programming, it can become obsessive and can also trigger or even open a door for a demon to begin its destruction of you. Now, you know, there are people in my faith, especially a lot of deliverance ministers and Christian ministers in general, that would tell you you should never, ever, ever watch demonic material, have them in your home, download them to your computer because those are doors. And I'm not saying I completely agree with that, but I'm also not saying I disagree with that because there's a danger to it. But in this case, this is one that I would actually suggest that if you do have some time, this is one that you might want to research. And we did some research here, and I've heard this story because of the things I do and the circles I run in. But I'm going to give a couple shout outs real quick. There's a podcast, it's a paranormal podcast called Lights Out. They do a episode on this, and as a matter of fact, from what I understand, is it's one of their latest episodes. As I was doing research, they actually popped up on my feed or on my search, and I got to listen to them, and they'll be a part of my commentary in just a second. But they did a pretty thorough job at some of the statistics. It's about an hour long, give or take. But that's one that I would encourage you to check out. There's a podcast called Unsettling Tales of True Horror. It's a smaller podcast, but it's a very brief depiction. And then there's another podcast about an hour long called Believing the Bizarre. And then, of course, we did some research basically by Googling this story in the BBC, in the news, the British Broadcasting Company news. And there's many stories because they were covering this as it was transpiring. And so a lot of the details we gathered from there and other news sources. So I didn't just take this information from podcasters and other people who cover paranormal topics or true crime topics. I also took this from some of the news articles. Now, again, I picked this case for this week's episode for a couple of reasons. Our normal episode that aired on Wednesday night, which would have been the 20th, we covered a letter from a non-believer, what I would call an angry atheist, who had a bunch of questions which I felt were trying to mock us or provoke us. But I did the episode using those questions because I felt like there are non-believers that will stumble onto this podcast who maybe aren't so angry and maybe actually want the answers to those questions. And so we answered them and we covered topics like, is the Bible true? Is it valid? Science, archaeology. And I did a pretty thorough discussion on those topics because I think a lot of times the world considers Christians either to be right or wrong. They're either accepting of your faith or they're mocking of your faith. And Christians sometimes get labeled as simpletons, but without breaking my arm to pat myself on the back, I am no simpleton. Pretty highly educated, pretty highly intelligent, as well as, committed to understanding the topics that the letter that I covered on Wednesday addressed, including archaeology, science, many of the things that people who consider themselves more intellectually superior, and if you listen to Wednesday's episode, you'll understand that title. But people who consider themselves intellectually superior consider us simpletons and use science and archaeology and other things to dismiss us. But in many cases, they're not as educated as they think they are, nor are they prepared for a Christian who can actually give you answers to these questions that you didn't think existed. And I'll give you an example before we get too far off topic. I'll give you an example. Archaeology is constantly changing the narrative on advanced civilizations. When I was young in the 70s and 80s, in school, in elementary school, middle school, there was science and archaeology was taught as if it was factual. But as I've progressed, it went from, advanced civilizations only being a certain, 5, 6, 7,000 years old to now archaeological digs have discovered these civilizations that they claim are anywhere from 12,000 to 15,000 years old. They state that humans were here for a lot longer, but that advanced civilizations were, doing things well before we thought humans can do that. So, to use some very generic terms, not to minimize archaeology and science, but we were cavemen one second, and the next thing you know, we're building these massive, intricate temple structures and cities with stonework and carvings that were well beyond not only what they thought people of the day could do, but things that we couldn't duplicate today. You realize there are not machines that exist now that could hoist the stones to build the Great Pyramid. If you take Pumapunku in Bolivia or Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, we don't possess the technology to build these structures now. So how did these primitive civilizations build these things? See, science and archaeology doesn't have an answer for that. Their responses are, well, science is still learning that as we go. So in one moment, science will tell you we don't know, but then on the other hand, they'll tell you science is science and that you should quote unquote trust the science because we know what we're talking about. But I hate to be provocative, but science is more guess and theory than it is law. Now, there are some things that would be considered law, like the second law of thermodynamics, stating that everything starts in order and works to disorder. I think we can see that, the law of gravity. I think we can see that to some extent. But many things are spoken of as law that aren't. And I say that because this type of thinking needs to be applied here because there are two distinct sides of this argument if you look into this case. Now, some of the research I've done, I heard commentary that had an anger and an animosity towards this family, that they are stupid, that they are uneducated, that they are so blind in their faith that this was a simple case of food poisoning, and that if the family would have just taken this poor man to the doctor, that he probably would still be alive. Now, I'm gonna say this, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart. I don't know if that's true. I think that is a huge possibility that if a doctor would have been involved, this man may still be alive. With that being said, there are many factors in this case that would indicate that this was well above and beyond food poisoning. And as a matter of fact, as we're hearing the story afterward, we are hearing legal commentary and legal documents are being surveyed. And these legal documents were put together by the judicial system to convict the family. Now, are there people who are so religious that they don't take their family to the doctor and expect prayer to heal everything? Yes. Is it possible that this family had some of that thinking? Sure. Now, let's kind of run with that side of the argument. If a family is so delusional or so what I would call hyper religious that they don't recognize that modern medicine is also valuable, they can contribute to the harm of a very close loved one, and maybe even out of a good heart or good intentions, but they're still doing harm. Now, let me put it in this perspective. I am somebody who believes in supernatural miracles of God. I have seen healing in ways that you couldn't argue if you wanted to. One time I was having a discussion with an atheist, and I would say friend of mine, but he was another one that was pretty antagonistic. And I explained to him that I've seen too much to not believe that God is truly who he says he is, that he's real, and that he is the savior that we've all been looking for. And this friend of mine, he said to me, "Give me an example of a miracle." And I explained to him, we had a small group of people that met in our home. Now, even as a minister, we still like to be involved in small groups, not just encourage our congregation members to be in small groups. We actually had our own small group that my wife at the time and myself hosted in our home. This was many years ago, decades ago. But one day in our small group, we were getting ready to do the Bible study, and one of our guys, him and his wife attended. It was a couples group, and he seemed off, and he wasn't gonna say anything, so I won't mention his name, but I said, "Hey, man, what's going on?" And he said to me, "I have cancer." Now, men are men. I love men's men. I love guys that are so tough that it's almost, like, ridiculous, but it's kinda hard to get hit in the face when somebody says, "Yeah, I got cancer," like it's like he got a sore throat. So, we prayed, and he stated that he's known for a little while, he didn't tell us the week before, but that it was blood cancer, leukemia, and he was going in for some testing to discuss what the plan of attack would be. And he broke down a little bit, which caused me to break down because I'm a crybaby anyway. I'll punch you in the face, don't get me wrong, but I'm pretty emotional and I don't hide it because I used to hide it and it was very dysfunctional. So I'll cry when I need to, I'll laugh when I need to. I emote pretty well, but when he started crying, I couldn't hold it in because this guy probably hadn't cried in 40 years. So we prayed and I said, I'm going to ask you a question, man. Like, you've only been going to church for a little while. And what are your real thoughts on God? He says, well, I've loved God, but like, this makes me question a lot of things. And I said, well, let's trust him. Let's trust him that he's going to be involved with these doctors and so on and so forth. So our group prayed with him. And, this is usually a Bible study that's a couple hours long, give or take. And we prayed the entire time for hours. And it was about 4 days later, the test occurred. And the night before our next Bible study, I checked in with him saying, hey, man, I know you probably got the results of your test. If not, we're still praying, but, you guys coming tonight? He goes, oh, we're coming. Trust me, I got to tell you guys some stuff. So when he came back the following week to that Bible study, which was exactly 7 days later, he brought documentation that the doctors could not understand why all the testing that was done showed a leukemia in his blood that was now dormant. It wasn't that it was gone. It was just not acting. It was like it was just in suspended animation. And that man, he's since passed away, but that man lived healthily for a long time, was back to his old self. He was kind of a daredevil type, do crazy things personality guy. And that's not what he died from. So when you tell me there's no God and that there's no supernatural miracles, I can't believe you because I've seen this. And I can tell you other stories, but that's one that I share a lot because there were doctors involved. There was paperwork involved. There were witnesses involved. There were people that witnessed this. It wasn't me and this gentleman making up a story. This is real. So, as somebody who believes very, very strongly in supernatural things, possession is real. And possession looks an awful lot like mental illness at first. It looks an awful lot like what we would call odd behavior. On the same token, as I hear these commentaries of these people who are mocking this family for not getting him medical care, in the basics of that, I agree. They should have went back to the doctor and said, "Hey, check him out again." I don't disagree with that. But if you research this case, you will hear commentary that says this was not possession at all. And this family is one of those religious, nutty families who takes God too far. But if you understand the facts of this case, you can't say that for sure. Well, how do I know that? Well, a jury said that. Now, juries get things wrong on both sides. I get that. But this is not my opinion versus their opinion. As you hear some of these commentaries, they dismiss the facts. Would they honestly believe? So let's take, for example, you're listening to a couple of guys on a commentary about this case, and they're talking about, I feel so bad for Kennedy. Why didn't this stupid family take him to the doctor? But I wonder if that same person who was making that statement, if his wife, who was loving and kind and compassionate, went to the doctor, they said nothing's wrong, but she started to exhibit signs of being so different and screaming things about demons and screaming things about mutilating herself and claiming that there's something evil inside of her. More importantly, that his life was in physical danger because she was attacking him at random times, violently, punching him, biting him. I wonder if he would truly believe in that moment that it was only medical or only mental health, or even a non believer would say, is this something else? Because the transformation, I will say, is so drastic. Now, as somebody who's worked with people in this type of ministry, that's one of the things I listen for. You can always go to some sort of research on the internet that says, how do you know somebody's possessed? Well, they have superhuman strength, they know things about the future, and they could talk in different languages. But there's other more subtle things like this person was this way, they had this event, now they are drastically different and acting evil when they were sweet and kind before. Now, could that be mental illness? Well, possibly, but once you get into the details of that, I think you start to suspect something else. And in this case, this man who comes from a very religious family seems to have shocked the family. Now, I also heard commentary that said that they absolutely believe that possession was possible. Now, in a much similar way or very similar way to the first commentary I discussed, I don't think you can say for sure that this was possession because there are other factors that are involved, including the minister from their church stating that he just looked sick to him and that what he assessed him that he was texting saying hi. So it's worth it to consider that that's possibly because this testimony was given in court and maybe he was trying to defend himself or to defend the church. I'm not sure. But this case is an important one for us to understand because even though believe strongly in deliverance ministry, I also believe that medical remedies and mental health remedies can also be beneficial. I said in previous podcasts, and in case you haven't heard that, I will say it again. I am somebody because I am bivocational in my past as a licensed therapist as well as an ordained minister. I have been called on to assess people prior to deliverance ministry. And sometimes that's harder to diagnose than others. But if I didn't believe in mental health as an issue, I wouldn't have gone to all that schooling, nor would I be able to come on here and say, after all of the clients that I treated, that it was all BS, because that's not true. I've watched people with bipolar disorder have tons of symptoms their whole life, begin to take medication, and live a normal life as long as they're on the medication. Now, am I saying that you couldn't say deliverance over that person and that person would be cured? No, that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that I've watched medical treatments help people. I've watched people with schizophrenia that spoke evil things begin to get treatment and began to take medication, but more importantly, learn how to reality test their lives that go on to live a very healthy life that didn't receive deliverance, and vice versa. I have seen people with severe mental health issues that had visited several therapists to no avail find a church, find a pastor who believes in deliverance, who spend an exorbitant amount of time with them, getting history, getting details, and then saying deliverance over that person and that person never having another mental health symptom again. See, this case is important because it's right down the middle. Do I think this family intentionally killed their family member, which is some of the accusations that were set because of all the wounds and the zip ties? And by the way, it's important to know that the cops did find a bag of zip ties and handcuffs that the family tried to hide in the neighbor's yard, stating that, they didn't know if they were supposed to own that type of stuff, so they threw it in the neighbor's yard. So that could be something that's considered, hiding evidence. So did the family kill this person on purpose? I just don't think so because I think the jury would have found that to be true, even if the jury would have just convicted them of a lesser charge, even just the false imprisonment and not the manslaughter, but they didn't. Now, I also do not believe that the family did everything they could medically to help their son, their brother. I don't believe that. Now, what would have happened if this family would have taken Kennedy to the doctor? Well, what we would hope and what I think critics of deliverance ministry would say they hoped is that the doctor would have found the diagnosis that he missed the first time, treated him medically, and he would have lived happily ever after. With that being said, couldn't the same also be true? What would the family have done, or what would you have done if the doctor ran an enormous battery of tests and said, there's nothing in his throat? We did an endoscopy, a colonoscopy. We checked his entire digestive tract. There's no parasites. There's no signs of any viruses or bacteria that would be causing the sore throat or for him to feel like there's something moving inside of him. There's nothing. Would that have made you a believer of the possession narrative? Here's what I know. If you are somebody who has ever dealt with the demonic, it is a very crafty being or beings that you are dealing with. They can affect you in ways that modern medicine and I would say modern thinking doesn't want to admit. People can have a spirit of infirmity or a spirit of sickness that can give you physical symptoms. That's actually in the Bible. If while you're doing your research, research that. Jesus prayed for people who were sick and demons went away. Think about that. Now, again, in this case, what I would say is that what we've learned is that if you feel you're somebody who is under demonic attack or somebody who you know is under demonic attack, I'm going to make a bold claim. I would suggest that you take them to the doctor first. I would suggest that you take them to a therapist first and explain to them honestly, we don't know what this is, and we are people of faith. So I would say a Christian therapist. If you're a Christian and your doctor is not a Christian, that may be an issue. Not because you shouldn't ever go to a doctor who's not a Christian. You should probably go to the best doctor, especially if it's brain surgeon or something like that. But if your primary care doctor is not somebody who shares your faith, why aren't you going to somebody who does? Because what if you had to talk about how your faith and medicine overlap? If you go to a non-believer or even somebody from a different faith, they are going to contradict what you believe. My personal family care doctor, I actually pay extra above and beyond my insurance to maintain a relationship with my medical doctor because I have a medical doctor that'll pray with me as well as prescribe me medication that I need. That will order blood work and pray over it before we get the results. Why not have that? Because in this case, you could have said, "Hey, doc, my family member might be possessed, but before we go down the road of deliverance, can you check them out? Hey, family therapist who's helped my child in the past, do you mind seeing Kennedy and see if something's going on or maybe something you saw earlier in his life? Because we think he might be possessed, but we want to check out the mental health side of it first." Because here's what I'm getting at. If you're going to a non-believer therapist and a non-believer doctor that doesn't believe these things exist, they're not going to be any help to you if there's no medical diagnosis. If you get lucky and it's simply a dehydration that is so severe that it was causing severe delusions, and they give them a couple IVs and the next day the person's delusions are gone, then you hit the jackpot. But if it's a harder diagnosis to discover, you're going to be stuck with, well, we don't know. But in reality, at least take them to somebody, because this family would have been much better off in terms of a 4-day deliberation. They probably would have only had a 40-minute deliberation if they would have said, prior to the exorcism, we took him back to the doctor and there was still nothing wrong. Now, do I believe justice wasn't done here? And I don't know. I don't try to insert myself in judicial matters because the system is flawed. The court system is extremely flawed. Many innocent people get convicted and many guilty people are found innocent. And so each case is different. Each jury is different. Each set of attorneys and prosecutors is different. I don't know. Was this gentleman possessed and the demon had too strong of a hold on him? And during the process of deliverance, this person simply succumbed, but the family actually saved his soul, even though they didn't save his life? I don't know that either. I wasn't there. But I'm never going to be somebody who shies away from the fact that there's controversy around this deliverance ministry. And I'm never going to be one of those, people from the Christian world that claims everything is demons, because that's just not true. On the same token, you've heard me say that I don't believe the satanic panic that was mocked, after the 90s when it kind of fizzled out was completely unfounded. I think we went from blaming the devil for everything to not blaming the devil for anything. And I think we need to get closer to understanding that demons are real. They exist. And if you've exhausted all of your other theories and philosophies about somebody's behavior, then you seek deliverance ministry from somebody who knows what they're doing, somebody who has been through a series of trainings as well as worked on themselves, because picking fights with demons is not the easiest thing to do. Let's put it that way. And I think my family would attest to the fact that even just jumping into this podcast over the last, several months has brought demonic attacks to our family because we're trying to help other people. So I hope you take this information not as a for sure Anthony Corelli solved my dilemmas. I hope you take it as one where you go out and do your own research and really solidify what you do believe. Because a man died in this case, and we're still not sure what happened, because not only is it controversial, but it shows the nuances of this topic known as deliverance ministry or exorcism. I'm going to thank you for contributing on Patreon to be able to access these episodes. Your support means a ton to us. We're not trying to be a zillionaire type Joe Rogan podcast. We're just trying to have a place for people to get some information and get some healing and basically some resources if they need it. So you contributing by hearing these episodes and paying for your Patreon subscription really helps us out a lot. So I wanted you to know that I thank you. I so appreciate what you're doing, and please keep coming back. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. We look forward to hearing you on future bonus episodes, as well as the main podcast on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. And last thing I want to just give you as information is, if you're listening to this podcast and you have found that you like this content, I want to remind you that I've made a decision to record my books. My first two books, The Struggle and the Sacrifice from the Struggle series, those first two books have been released for a while, but I've decided to put them on separate podcasts. Right now, we're in the process of downloading chapters from The Struggle, which is book one of the Struggle series. So you could listen to a handful of chapters, and we should be releasing chapters every other day or so until we get that entire book loaded, and then we'll start working on book two. I wanted to make that content available because a lot of you, buying books is tough. I never set out to make $1 million on the books either. I just wanted it to be an avenue to get a gospel message out through speaking of paranormal activity and demonic possession in a way that was not only fictional but contained a gospel message and some true stories about my time in full-time deliverance ministry. So if you're interested, you could find the first book by searching on your podcast app. It's called The Struggle, Book One dash The Struggle series, because there's so many things titled The Struggle, and because it's a new podcast, you won't find it right away. So you have to put in the entire title so it pops up on your screen. You can listen to that free anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thank you so much for joining us again, and may God grant you many blessings and give you peace.
Thank you for listening to the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. Make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, and we will see you next time.